Thank you so much, Assemblymember Carrillo, for those introductions. And it's a real pleasure to continue the conversations with this year's class of Gabby Giffords Rising Star nominees. I'm thrilled to be here with this second set of nominees. You're going to hear from them, and wait until you do, because they have a lot to say. To get us started, Assemblymember Cruz, you are the very first Dreamer to be elected to the New York State Assembly. Yay, my state. How have your own experiences as a Dreamer, representing your community, influence, number one, why you ran, but number two, how you are leading and serving?
First of all, it is the honor of a lifetime to be in your presence, even if it's in digital form. You have opened doors so that the rest of us can walk through them, and it is my absolute honor to be here. Growing up as a dreamer, I came from Colombia when I was 9 years old, and I spent about 13 years living as an undocumented American. And during that time, I saw my mother and my family and I endure discrimination, wage theft. I had a mother who went from being a nurse in Colombia to being a domestic worker in the United States. And so I got to see what my community was living through still to this day, 20 years later. And I was inspired to run when the former president began making plans to come after my community. I knew that it was at the local level that we would be able to protect folks. And there were still children in every corner of Corona who looked like me, who lived my experiences. I happen to represent the district with the highest number of undocumented New Yorkers, and making them the most vulnerable community for the anti-immigrant attacks. And I ran a quote unquote insurgent campaign, and I ran because people like my mother still needed that representation, because people like myself were still not able to afford college. By the time I ran, we still didn't have the In-State Dream Act. We're still working for the federal one at this point. And so I knew that it was the right time politically, to be honest, for someone like me to run. But I also had the experience. I became an attorney, and I spent 10 years working in government and representing people like my family. And I knew that I had what it took to have my community at heart at every single decision. And over the last year, that's what I've done. This is my third year in office, but the last year has been the most difficult, I think, for all of us. When COVID hit, I knew that I needed to go back to the basics, that it wasn't about politics, that it wasn't about passing legislation. It was literally about survival. So I turned my office with the help of Opal, who I believe you know, into a food pantry. And between the middle of March and the middle of September, we gave out more than 250,000 meals and boxes of food with the partnership of World Central Kitchen. And we gave out PPE. And actually, at some point, we were the only office of a local elected, of a state elected, that was open. We even had a baby pantry. We were giving out diapers and baby food because we had to go back to the basics, because I understood, based on my lived experience, that politics was not what was going to keep us alive. It was literally food and looking after our people.
Oh, Catalina, that's such a great story. And of course, Opal, who worked for me for a number of years, is now working for Vice President Harris. But taking with her that same sense of service that you and she not only exemplified, but literally delivered to your community. Because let's remember what it was like in New York at the beginning of the pandemic. And there weren't a lot of places open, and there were not a lot of places providing the services that you did. So really, thank you so much for everything. Let me turn now to Representative Lekanoff from Washington State. You've also said, Representative, that your leadership has been shaped by the lessons you learned growing up in a small tribal community. Can you share with us more about that and tell us how both your background and experiences have helped to develop your own unique leadership style?
Well, thank you. First, Secretary Clinton, thank you for being just an incredible leader for all of us girls who look like us, all of the leadership qualities that you've risen in us. We just couldn't be here without the leadership that you've provided. On behalf of Indian country, Secretary Clinton, thank you. You never forgot Indian country and all the years that you have done your leadership in the United States. You've always been a friend to us. As the only Native American to serve in the entire state legislature, it really has been a unique opportunity to be able to work side by side with people who look like me and sound like me on truly the floor of the people's house. As a first American of this great America, I look back at what I've been able to do in my 20 years as a governmental service and 3 years as serving as an elected representative. And I thank the teachings that came from my aunties, from my culture. I was a poor girl growing up in a small town of 300 on the shorelines of Yakutat, located in Southeast Alaska. My days were spent flaying salmon with my aunties, picking berries, picking seaweed, beading, speaking in the language that originally came from my homelands. Who would ever have known this little Indian girl would be sitting, talking to Park, talking to Catalina, and talking to Hillary? It's an amazing opportunity. But what I'm doing today is just providing a pathway for the next generation of young women who look like us and sound like us to know that they matter, to know that their aunties are building them for a better future. We're generation makers, my friends. We are generation makers. We build the next generation. That's who we are as women. That's who we are as Indigenous people. But that's who we are as the first Americans. My upbringing, I believe, provided an opportunity to serve in the state legislature and pass monumental bills that impacted our community. We were there to take care of our people. We are there to build good policy. We were there to address climate change, a COVID crisis, homelessness. We're there to include health care for all people. We had some monumental legislature that we passed in Washington state that really did what we felt was best and what I view as carrying our Native American values. We wrapped our arms around Washingtonians and we made sure they had food in their cupboard. The heat was turned on. COVID vaccinations were provided for everyone. My most inspiring work that I did was working with our migrant farm workers here in Washington state and making sure that they had PPE, that they had the sanitation for their hands, and that just recently they were moving first in line to get COVID shots. These are the people who provide food for all of us. They take care of us and we should take care of them. And that's part of the value system that I believe helps me be a better legislator and reminds me to let that ladder down for the next young lady to climb up, just as you did, Secretary Clinton, for us, and just as Emily's list does for us.
Oh, Debra, I love that story. I love the image of you with your aunties and now carrying forward their lessons and their motivation to do what needs to be done to help and lift up people. It's so exciting to know that you're there, and literally you represent so many generations and ancestors going back, just as you are a generation changer and a generation builder and transformer going forward. I want to turn now to Representative Cannon. Wow, I'll tell you what, Park, you hit the ground running in Georgia. From the moment you were elected as one of only 3 LGBTQ members in the entire state legislature, to that moment when you stood there and knocked on that door to get let in to see that governor of yours sign that voter suppression legislation. You have been a voice and a presence to be reckoned with. How has your background, your experiences inspired you to create change and to take risks to create it?
Thank you. Absolutely is right. As a young person in Georgia, deciding to run for office was daunting. I didn't know if our collectives were wide reaching enough. And I was concerned about what people would say about a millennial running for office. But I had to realize that my roots are deep in the deep South. From every corner of the state of Georgia where there have been issues related to race or identity, my family has been there. They were not elected officials. They were slaves and then sharecroppers, and then they worked at the chicken plant, and then they finally got into the healthcare systems and joined the military. And so our entire identity as a campaign has been wrapped around there's so much that happened in the past in our roots, but what happens about looking forward? How can we be looking out for people? So we made my campaign logo glasses so that it would say that. And we have continued to look out for opportunities to show what an activist elected official looks like. Me knocking on that door, that was what an activist elected official could look like, even though that circumstance was very unusual and was unlawful, which is why the charges were dropped within 2 weeks. We have to think about the ways to look forward. And I thank you in English, gracias en español, y obrigada en portugués for all that you've done for our communities.
Oh, Park, I love that. But the idea of vision and looking forward is something that we all have to keep in mind, because it is so easy to get mired in the day-to-day, to get somewhat discouraged by all of the opposition to what should be accepted, like everybody votes, for example. So we do have to keep our focus on the future. And as I said in the first panel, since taking office, each of you and the communities you serve have been through so much. And all of this has made public service even more vital. So, Debra, how have you kept going in the face of all of the challenges of the last year? I remember all of the news reports coming out of the state of Washington while you were struggling on the first wave of the pandemic, the tough decisions that were being made. How have you tried to find your way forward as an elected representative this past difficult and quite unprecedented year?
Well, thank you for that question. You're absolutely right. In a year when we faced a COVID pandemic, an economic crisis, we faced racism spreading across our communities. I really turned towards those cultural teachings that I spoke about earlier, the strength of being a woman leader, knowing that I come from a matriarch society, knowing that it was my role to step up and lead, to wrap my arms around others, to bring them along with me, to be strong enough to make the bold decisions. As we were addressing a COVID crisis, Washington State Legislature was passing some of the strongest climate change and environmental bills that we'd see across this nation. We were passing 5 of the strongest public safety bills, saying no more will we have our vulnerable communities not feel safe in their own communities. We were passing a capital gains tax, of taxing only the very wealthiest so we could pay and give money to the very poorest. I took strength in the teachings of rising as we do as women, but rising as I need to as a Native American woman, sitting on the floor of the people's house, and the only person who looks like me and sounds like me is me. And sitting on that floor and reaching out and sharing with my colleagues, we have this. We have each other. We can move tough public safety, police reform. We can address racism straight on. We can talk about equity and diversity and incorporate it into every Washington state policy that we could. We could push forward environmental laws that say we need a healthy environment for all, and our vulnerable communities come first. It was inspiring for me, I think, Secretary Clinton, to see my 17-year-old daughter look at me and say, "Mom, I want to be you one day." And as a single mom and having my daughter say that, and she watches me work every day just as you. I was inspired to work just a little bit harder because that ladder that you dropped down for me, that I'm dropping down for her, she's going to be climbing up it. And that gives me hope. That gave me energy. That gave me that motherhood, that generation maker, that decision maker, just one more step forward to get it done.
Oh, that's a great story. Please tell your daughter we're going to watch her climb that ladder that you have dropped down and made sturdy for her. And Park, you've been a tireless champion through all of the problems in Georgia for voting rights. I mean, honestly, I feel terrible that you still have to keep making the case that in a democracy, guess what? Every eligible person deserves to be able to vote. And you keep being strong in the face of such abuses of power, because that's really what they are. You don't like the outcome of an election, change the laws and try to prevent people from voting. That's really what has gone on in Georgia. So how do you see where that fight is right now? And what gives you hope that you're going to be able, along with your allies in and out of government, prevent the total suppression of hundreds of thousands of legitimate votes in the next election?
Well, we have to keep knocking. We realize that the metaphor wrote itself. I came down from serving in the General Assembly that day. I served as the secretary of the caucus. So I had all my papers, I had my bags, I had the members in tow, and we went downstairs to leave the Capitol. We didn't even know the bill was being signed, but we heard it was being signed in 7 minutes. So a few of us walked quickly back from the parking lot, and everything was unusual. There were police outside of the governor's office. It was really hush-hush and closed off. And so we shortly started to realize that there were actually legislative members in the room. And at that point, just like any other bill signing, 2 days ago, they signed the citizens arrest bill out in the open. All the legislators could to attend to applaud. So we realized that we had to be present. That was all that we could even do. So that day, March 26th, I simply wanted to be present as people's rights were being signed away. I wanted my face to be etched into the memory of my colleagues who couldn't stand to put the bill online until the bill had been passed and then sign it into law a few hours later. It was imperative that in the spirit of other proud and important Black women, Rosa Parks, Simone Bell, the person whose seat I came into, Nikema Williams, the Democratic Party chair, who's now a congresswoman, Stacey Abrams, my first leader. It was imperative that we found ourselves a space in that room, and we will keep knocking because we have to.
Good for you. I am thrilled to hear that because, you're on the right side of history, and despite the setbacks, you can never, ever give up. That's what the other side wants. They want us to get discouraged and feel like, oh, it just doesn't do any good. They're so powerful and they can do whatever they want. Well, no. That's not the story we're writing. So I can't wait to see what's next for you, Park. And Catalina, you've done so much since being elected last fall. And I loved, you talking about how you turned your legislative office literally into a storefront to serve the needs that people had, everything from food to diapers. As you look both back and forward, what do you think was the biggest accomplishment that you and your colleagues were able to achieve? And what's next when you look at the needs of your constituents?
Okay, I think if I could point to only one thing, it would be a miracle. It took an entire village literally to keep many of our neighbors alive. I happen to represent the epicenter of the epicenter, where many of my neighbors passed away, lost their jobs, businesses were closed. But I think if we look back, it was that hope that if we worked together as a legislature, that if we worked with our neighbors, literally with our next door neighbors, that if we worked with the moms in the community, with the community advocates, that we would be able to keep as many people alive, as many businesses open, and that one day we could be even better than we were before. I think the next thing is going to be really taking an in-depth look, because anecdotally we know our government failed, but we have to take a really deep look at where we invested wrong, where do we need to change our investment to, and how do we create the kind of community that doesn't ignore people simply because they lack a piece of paper, that doesn't only rely on them during elections, but during the hardest time in our country, we turn our back on them because they don't have that piece of paper. We have to really take a look at our priorities as legislators. Where are we spending our money? Where are we spending our time? And I am actually extremely proud of the budget that our legislature was able to pass through this year, because we told the world we want to help small businesses survive. We care about our undocumented Americans because they're as American as the rest of us. We care about keeping people in their homes. And if we have to tax a few rich people to get it done, then that is exactly what we're going to do. But now we have to really look at the healthcare needs of our community. I have an entire segment of my district that cannot afford to go to get preventative healthcare. And that is the same segment of the population who couldn't self-isolate, who is now having trouble accessing vaccines, and who still can't get back to work. So we're going to take a really hard look at working with them, at creating new job opportunities, at working across the aisle. I know some folks don't love that word, but sometimes you find unlikely partners. I did in expanding the Nourish New York program, which actually brought food from upstate New York farms that was literally going to waste, down to the very same places that were helping me give out food to the needy. And I found someone across the aisle who is my partner in making this happen. And we invested through the budget $50 million into the program. And now we're working to make it a permanent program so that all of New York can benefit. Secretary Clinton, my district happens to be one of the only ones in the entire state of New York without a permanent food pantry. A permanent food pantry, we don't have one. That's why I had to open up mine. And I find hope in knowing that we as legislators are having to take a look at ourselves, at our own priorities, because for a very long time, many people were more worried about keeping that power and less worried about the people. And now we were forced by nature to look at the people and to care for the people and to put the people first.
Oh, well, everybody who's watching tonight, I just am so inspired. I love talking with these amazing young women. They're all young to me. And knowing that, they're in elected office, that we have Democratic women leaders who are meeting the challenges of this moment in our country's history. And just a real brief final word from each of you. What would you say to young people who are going to watch this about the hope you have as to what we can do if we work together? Park, let's start with you.
Regardless of the situation, there are so many male-dominated systems that we have to become proximate to. Do not be afraid to run for office. If you don't want to run for office, don't be afraid to work on a campaign. If you don't want to work on a campaign, consider going into a field that is already male-dominated and becoming a decision maker for others in that, whether that's law enforcement, the STEM technology communities, or even education. I look forward to being there with you.
Excellent. Well, if you want to run for office, you've come to the right place, because Emily's List will be there to help you. Catalina, what about you? What's your message?
I first want to congratulate. I didn't get a chance to say congratulations to my fellow nominees. And I think that is actually my message. When you look at all of us, we all come from different backgrounds. Many of us grew up very poor. I grew up so poor, I've often told the story of my mother and I collecting cans just to make ends meet. And if someone like me can make it out, if someone like me can go on to higher education, to walking the halls of power, to decision making, and chose to stay in my community, I want you to do the same. I'm going to piggyback on what Park said. Go out into the universe, be a change maker, but don't leave your community. We need you. We need you to come back to that same neighborhood that saw you grow up and help us move us forward.
Oh, absolutely right. Last word to our first American, Debra.
Thank you so much. As a first American, my message to you is be a survivor, be a decision maker, be that woman who's going to rise and take women with you. We're going to make a difference. We're going to make a difference when you work together, when you respect one another, and when you rise as one group of women making a difference and making decisions for 7 generations to come. We got this.
Wow, what a great panel. I can't thank each of you enough. I hope I get to see every one of you in person sometime in the post-vaccine world that we're hopefully moving into rapidly. And before I go, I want to congratulate all of this year's Gabrielle Giffords Rising Star nominees. You can see why they are all rising stars, can't you? This is an incredibly accomplished group of women leaders. I know it's just the beginning for each and every one of them. I will be cheering you all every step of the way. And I want to thank everyone who has turned in to support the vital work of Emily's List, recruiting and training candidates, supporting campaigns, researching issues that affect women and families, and getting women out to vote. We've seen again and again over these last several years that elections have consequences and leadership matters. So let's keep doing everything we can to elect more Democratic women to public office. In the meantime, everybody, if you haven't gotten vaccinated yet, please do so. It will help us emerge from this pandemic safer and stronger. So thank you all so much. Onward we go.